1996. The horror genre is dead. The slasher genre is deader. The shambling corpses of once beloved icons have milked their cash cows dry and weakly farted out what seemed to be their final films. A new kid on the block that seemed to have a promising start has already started to falter critically, more than halving its box office takings just 2 sequels later. And a sincere attempt to reinvigorate a franchise star fell short of commercial expectations. Horror has had its 80s heyday, but studios are starting to think the party's over and it's time to go home. And then, out of nowhere, a ghost-faced masked villain kicks down the door, kegs of beer under each arm, and announces the party's just begun. And 25 years later, just having had its anniversary, it still runs a fun party. This is Scream. It is impossible to overstate just how incredibly important Scream was to the horror and slasher genre. It didn't just make a big critical and commercial splash, it literally made horror cool again. With a couple of notable exceptions that came mostly very early in the decade, like People Under the Stairs, Candyman and Misery to name some, the 90s was an absolute desolate wasteland for horror films, especially when compared to the 80s boom in the genre we'd just had the decade prior. It wasn't that horror wasn't getting made at all and new franchises were churning out with moderate cult appreciation, but come on, when the 80s gave us titles like The Lost Boys, The Shining, The Fly, Gremlins, Evil Dead 2, Aliens, Poltergeist, Hellraiser, Child's Play, and introduced us to the American icons of Freddy and Jason, it's really not looking good when we get halfway into the 90s and what do we have so far? Leprechaun? Hideaway? Jason Goes to Hell? And don't get me wrong, the 80s had its fair share of middling and crap stuff too. It's just that it had so many heavy hitters to offset that balance. Whereas the first 5 years of the 90s had maybe one standout title a year, and the rest was at best alright, and at worst, just proper rubbish. Scream changed all of that. A hot ticket script from the word go, Scream was the brainchild of screenwriter Kevin Williamson, although at that stage its working title was simply Scary Movie. This would be Kevin's first film to actually get made. He had previously sold a script called Killing Mrs. Tingle that generated a lot of buzz at the time and was picked up by a studio in 1995, but then was shelved. With only one sold script to his name that looked like it was never going to see the light of day, Kevin was desperate to get something out there with his name attached that people could actually know him for, especially since the money from Mrs. Tingle didn't last him long and he was fast becoming broke. The idea for Scream came when, while house sitting for a friend, Kevin managed to scare himself. It was late at night. He was staying in somewhat unfamiliar surroundings. He was alone, and the TV had started to play murder documentaries. Freaked out and looking for something to ground him, Kevin called another friend and the two got talking. The topic? Favourite scary movies. And anyone who has ever seen Scream will understand why this was the light bulb moment. Retreating to an undisturbed room, Kevin blasted out Scream in either just 3 or 30 solid days, depending on who you ask, handed it into his agents, and a bidding war immediately started over the script that saw Kevin's life changing when he was handed a $400,000 check by winning studio Dimension Films, a newer offshoot studio of Miramax that focused on genre pieces. The film moved quickly into pre-production and they were keen to get a big name horror director attached, but several turned it down, including guys like George Romero, Sam Raimi, and even their first choice who would eventually go on to become the film's director, Wes Craven. You see, Wes was keen to get out of horror, having felt uneasy for a while at the misogyny that plagued a lot of the genre, including his own work. Though obviously a legend in the genre himself, he wasn't sure he wanted to keep contributing to films that seemed to celebrate violence against women. And the iconic opening scene in the script that saw a young woman threatened, stalked, and killed by an unknown caller initially rubbed him the wrong way. When the studio told him they had gotten Drew Barrymore attached, he considered the job a little more, having been surprised that such a big star would want to do a script such as this, but it still wasn't enough to convince him. In the end though, as Craven tells in the documentary Scream, The Inside Story, the thing that got him to take the job was a sassy 12-year-old. One day at a convention, some little kid told him that he should do a real kick-ass film again because lately his movies had gone soft, a conscious effort on Craven's part to tone down his films. It was this small interaction that made Craven realise that of his body of work, the stuff that really resonated with people was the stuff that was more uncompromising, and this was all the kick in the arse he needed to decide to do Scream. So, whoever that little 12-year-old was, if you're out there, if you're watching this somehow, let me just say, well fucking done, you literally changed the face of horror forever by being a bit cheeky to Wes Craven, you absolute mad lad. Shockingly though, they almost lost Wes again when production hit a big roadblock that later on turned out to be one of its biggest blessings, when at the last minute, just 6 weeks before shooting began, Drew Barrymore changed her mind. Originally supposed to play the main role, Barrymore decided that she liked the opening scene so much that she wanted to play the girl killed in that introductory sequence. What felt like a fatal blow for the film, relegating its most bankable name to a minor position, actually turned out to be one of its biggest strengths. It was actually Drew Barrymore herself who argued that this would be a smart move, as they could still heavily advertise her role in the film, and everyone would think that since the film opens on her and she's obviously the biggest star, that she'd obviously survive the whole runtime. Then, when those expectations were subverted, it would set it up for the audience that anything could happen. Which is such a perfect opening sentiment for Scream because that's its entire central conceit. This is exactly what makes Scream so special. In a genre that had come to be defined by played out tropes and paint by the numbers storytelling, Scream understood that slasher audiences had grown smart, and then it dared to be smarter. It's an extremely simple premise, but one that shockingly had never really been done before. A horror movie made for and starring people who have seen horror films. Kevin Williamson adored horror and slasher movies, and he wrote a script that featured characters just like him. The teens of Scream are probably the most media literate slasher cast to ever exist. They know the tropes, they know the conventions, they understand the assignment, and they're all probably gonna die anyway. It's like a direct challenge to every armchair critic who has sat through a slasher, rolled their eyes and said, well, I'd never do that, or so she's gonna die now, or this is just like that other film, to let the room know how clever they are. Scream gives those people all the breadcrumbs and clues they need to think they've figured it all out, and then pulls the rug from under them. Everything an audience could say about the film, the characters in the movie say out loud themselves. They speculate over who the killer will be. They vocally discuss the horror movie rules. They reference other films. They complain about tropes. In essence, they're real teenagers. This film had an unparalleled finger on the pulse sensibility when it came to American teens. After sitting through the likes of the Kumbaya singing camp counselors of Friday the 13th, or any of the equally copy and paste how do you do fellow kid casts that filled out slasher movie sequels for years, Scream's teens feel like a huge breath of fresh air. They're knowledgeable, grounded, flawed, likeable and smart. It's like a John Hughes cast managed to accidentally stumble into a slasher flick. After opening on the aforementioned incredible scene-setting killing of Drew Barrymore, which could honestly just be a successful horror short film in its own right, the film follows Sydney, a young woman dealing with the trauma of her mother's murder a year prior, who has old wounds made fresh again when this new killer rises up in town and draws comparisons to the events surrounding her mother. Sydney quickly finds that the similarities between these new killings and that traumatic day may not be merely incidental, as she finds herself and friends become new targets for this ghost-faced cheap costume store killer who repeatedly attacks and taunts them with a consistent focus on Sydney. With no idea who the man behind the mask is and his presence being a constant threat that can surface at almost any time, it's up to Sydney to keep her guard up, dodge a pushy tabloid press presence in anchorwoman Gail Weathers, who is writing a book about these events and Sydney's mother's death, and survive until this killer is captured, all the while trying to solve the mystery the police can't, as she speculates with her friends as to who the man behind the mask could be while the bodies pile up around them. Throw in some teen issues like relationship troubles and dealing with gossip and rumours surrounding her terribly sensationalised life, then finish on a horror house party finale that's so big, so full of twists and turns and spectacular set pieces that it takes up over 40 minutes of the film's runtime and took such a painfully exhausting 21 dusk till dawn nights to shoot that the entire crew got t-shirts saying they survived filming the scene, and you've got yourself Scream. And when you sum it up like that, it probably doesn't sound anything special, right? Just your standard slasher. Masked killer, teen targets, a definitive final girl, it's all very familiar territory. But it's in what Scream does with the journey over these well-treaded grounds that makes it so special. It's suspenseful. The threat never lets up, constantly lurking in the background or jumping out to attack in the light of day. It's twisty as hell. The film says it best itself. Everyone is a suspect. There's red herrings on top of red herrings on top of red herrings. I'm consciously choosing not to talk about its amazing finale, even though I go into spoilers a lot on this show, just on the off chance none of you have seen it, because you really need to experience how it plays out firsthand. It's amazingly acted. Every single person in this movie has been cast flawlessly. Neve Campbell is a believably troubled lead. Courtney Cox's Gail Weathers is fantastically awful as the blood-chasing, fame-hungry reporter. Drew Barrymore's short stint still ends up being a 5-star performance that never leaves your memory. Rose McGowan offers a great best friend for Sydney to bounce off. Professional wrestling legend and former WCW World Champion David Arquette brings fantastic heart to the piece, feeling almost intentionally out of place as a kind of "aw shucks" in over his head deputy, at contrast with the smart-mouthed teens. Jamie Kennedy's Randy is such a perfect little pretentious dork. Everybody who has ever even been in the vicinity of a conversation on film knows a Randy. Skeet Ulrich makes for an irritatingly handsome and charismatic love interest. Like, fuck you, dude. Fuck you for looking like that, and fuck you for having such an attractive air of mystery to you. Not fair. Leave some sexiness for the rest of the world. I swear if this film had been made today, Twitter and TikTok would be plagued with fan cams made of montages of clips of this character here. Roger Jackson as the voice of Ghostface is phenomenally menacing. On set, Craven didn't let the other actors see who was doing the voice so they could imagine the most fearsome person on the other end of the calls. And they must have had an easy job thinking of someone terrifying, because that voice is chilling. And my absolute favourite performance of them all, a shining star that stands out even amongst a sea of already shining stars, Matthew Lillard Stew. The playful, kinda dorky, kinda douchey best friend of Skeet's Billy is the absolute best. I swear to God. Some people say he's too over the top, but nah, totally disagree. He gives it 1,000,000% and he is absolutely pitch perfect. It's pure gold. It's one of the single most entertaining performances of anything ever. This film is excellent. There are so many moments of inspired genius here. Like, if I ever write something as cleverly metatextual as Jamie Kennedy's character watching Halloween and screaming at Jamie Lee Curtis, "Look behind you, Jamie! Jamie! Jamie, behind you!" as the audience watching are saying the exact same thing to him, then I'm gonna become insufferably arrogant, because that shit is genius. The whole film is genius. Its pace is spot on. Its performances knock it out the park. The dialogue is tight, the concept original and refreshing. It is no wonder that this became the new template for horror that spawned a sea of homages and rip-offs and influenced decades of future filmmakers afterwards. Films as recent as this year, 25 years after its release, are still making nods to it. Scream is that important and influential. Quite frankly, it's just a phenomenal piece of work. In fact, you know what? It's not just phenomenal, it's perfect. I'm officially adding it to the small collection of movies I've covered this month that I can file under perfect. Sure, I can make the very small complaint that one of the characters isn't really mourned when perhaps they should be, but even that I'm not sure counts as a flaw, because any additions to this film would ruin its spot-on pacing. There's not a second of runtime in this film wasted. And as if it couldn't get any more perfect, it also has my personal favourite instance of pettiness ever. As right at the end of the special thanks section of the film's credits reads, "No thanks whatsoever to the Santa Rosa City School District Governing Board, who voted to kick them out of a high school they had a contract to use during production." Brilliant. That's not my favourite credit in the film though. My favourite one has a bit of a story behind it. So apparently, when making the movie, the script just said, "a ghostly white mask." And the filmmakers had absolutely no idea what that looked like, but it was their job to interpret what that meant. They tried a bunch of different masks, but all the designs they went through just didn't work. Now obviously, we all know in the end what they settled on, that iconic drooping face reminiscent of Edvard Munch's The Scream. But how did they settle on this? Well, it turns out they just found it. When doing a location scout on an old house, producer Marianne Madalena, as if by fate, literally just stumbled upon the mask in one of the bedrooms. She asked the owner what it was, and apparently her husband collected masks and she had no idea where he got it. They asked to borrow the mask and Wes just instantly fell in love with it. Problem was, they didn't own it and they had no idea who did. So they decided to tweak it to avoid copyright, but every modification they did just made it look wrong. It was literally just perfect in its unedited form. Against his better judgment, Wes decided to shoot a whole day using this mystery mask, worrying the whole time that he was going to get the studio sued and never work again if they couldn't track the source of this thing down. Luckily, they eventually found it was an in-house product of a little mom and pop joint called Fun World. They called the owner and asked if they could use it in a movie, and he said, "Sure, just send $100 and put our company name in the credits." And there you have it. Look at that. Cinema history on a fluke find and $100 deal. Bargain. Also, another bit of fun trivia, the film had a nightmare trying to release with an R rating as the MPAA kept certifying it with NC-17, which would have been a kiss of death for the film. And seemingly no edits they were willing to compromise on was able to lower that rating until Dimension Films head Bob Weinstein called them up and told them it was a comedy. He basically argued that because it was a comedy, the intense stuff should be viewed with a lens of comedic context, and that it's all parody and spoof, as gory as it might be, and they agreed to lower the age rating. Wes even joked after it worked that he was going to say that every film he made after Scream was a comedy. I couldn't find a way to shoehorn this story into the rest of the video, so you're getting it here. But actually, the fact that Bob could argue this case is testament to how great Scream's tone, characters, and subversions of horror tropes are. It might be an excellent slasher film, but it's also excellent satire. And between that, the petty credit call out, and the hilarious rating system bluff that actually somehow paid off, how can you not celebrate this movie? So after the first Scream lit the horror world on fire in 1996 and became a huge runaway box office hit, the studio wanted a sequel and they wanted it fast. So with only a year to turn it all around and nothing but a 5-page outline before production started, could Scream 2 ever really capture that lightning in a bottle, sharp satirical wit of its predecessor? Yeah, actually, it's pretty good. Following very quickly in the footsteps of the first film, Scream 2 went into production while that original movie was still in cinemas. With no time to even so much as breathe in their prior success, the filmmakers and cast had a hell of a time making this sequel. Of course, the schedule had to be extremely rushed, and to make matters worse, an almost completed working script was leaked onto the internet and revealed the film's killers, which caused a huge headache for everyone involved, as pretty much the whole thing had to be rewritten throughout production, and pages were sometimes completed on the day they would be filmed.
And then Kevin sent us, I think something like 30 pages by email. We read it, it was fabulous. It was on the internet in its entirety that night. And all of you little fuckers out there that think that's really cute, you fucking ruined our next 3 months.
By all accounts, the process of getting Scream 2 to the big screen on such a tight deadline while also working around the leaks was an extremely stressful nightmare. So it probably would have been a safe bet when all circumstances were considered that the film would fall flat. Had you somehow been following its development over the year, I imagine it was probably a fair expectation to assume this would have went the way of most slasher sequels. A quick cash grab, thrown together at the last minute when they realised their IP name had huge franchise potential and they could sell a series on name and the success of the original alone. Against all odds though, Scream 2 kinda slaps. Opening on the incredibly brilliant and incredibly meta idea of the tragedies of the first film having been tastelessly milked into a large multimedia franchise coming off the back of Courtney Cox's character Gail's sensationalist book, The Woodsboro Murders. We're greeted with 2 new characters, a couple named Phil and Maureen at the premiere of this new movie called Stab. Love that. Such a perfect parody title for Scream. It could honestly have been an alternate name for the franchise. Scream is the better name, but still, Stab's a solid plan B. While in the queue for the movie, the two characters have some back and forth cute little bickering, as Maureen wanted to see the new Sandra Bullock film, but Phil won some free tickets to Stab, and they're all very likeable, and they make some keen observations on the general fates of characters of colour within horror movies, but don't get too attached because they naturally aren't going to make it past the opening credits. In a scene that really interestingly explores the sometimes absurd relationship between audiences in the horror genre, the two enter an absolute nightmare of a theatre, packed to the rim with rowdy patrons, many of which are wielding prop knives and masks in tribute to their favourite real-life serial killer, whom they cheer for whenever they're on screen, just as audiences of the past would root for the likes of Freddy and Jason. The film then cuts cleverly between our couple in the audience and the events of the Stab movie on screen, which plays out like a shot-for-shot remake of the first film's events with new actors, only now with added nudity, in a sly dig at sensationalist horror's over-reliance on cheap titillation. While at the cinema, our newly introduced couple are eventually killed by an unknown assailant, disguising themselves amongst the crowd by wearing the same serial killer garb that decorated the first film's murders and now most of the audience. In a really quite chilling, effective ender to this sequence, Maureen stumbles her way to the front of the screen, and as she screams in anguish, she bleeds out in front of the audience, all decorated in her killer's visage. I really love the way that as some of the audience members realise what's going on, they remove their masks, as if they don't want to be a part of this celebration of violence when confronted with the reality with which it's based on. Honestly, if I didn't know any better, I'd think director Wes Craven wrote this scene and not screenwriter Kevin Williamson, as it feels very much like the natural evolution of the commentary he was making in New Nightmare. If you haven't watched my video on that already, check it out after this one and you'll see what I mean. It's appropriate that he's the director for this franchise, as it's very much in his wheelhouse after his Elm Street 7 work. After this new couple's deaths, we cut to Windsor College, where they used to attend classes, and where seniors and returning cast Sidney Prescott and Randy Meeks still do. There's a great little acknowledgement of how prepared for and done with this shit Sidney is when she gets a call from a stranger doing the Ghostface voice, but instead of reacting terrified, she just reads them their caller ID. Sidney ain't got time for this nonsense. Especially when news of the cinema slayings reaches the college and the press, including First Film's infamous reporter Gail Weathers, who all descend upon the scene with fervour, ready for the latest scoop. Fearing these killings are related to her past, Sidney confides in her new friend and roommate Hallie, her new boyfriend Derek, his best friend Mickey, and a returning Officer Dewey who came out to check up on her after the news of the murders hit. And of course, fellow Woodsboro survivor and old friend and classmate Randy, who in one of my favourite little character developments now studies film. Because of course he does. As someone who studied film in college and then went to university and got both a bachelor's degree and a master's in the subject, I've done a fair few film modules, and I can promise you that every film course you will ever take has a Randy on it. In his class, Randy is of course a smart mouth know-it-all who thinks because he recognises a couple of tropes in the genre that he is somehow God's gift to film analysis, and can make generalised statements like all sequels are by definition inferior movies, with barely anything to back it up besides a smirk and a disagreement with anyone who would challenge him on the matter. Great character, very believable, very grounded, and very perfectly teenage in his understanding of movies, but boy is he irritatingly familiar if you've ever had to sit through someone trying to argue that, say, the plot holes in Toy Story make it a bad movie. Plus, what he says next, I simply cannot forgive.
Aliens is a classic, okay? Get away from her, you bitch. I believe the line is stay away from her, you bitch. It's film class, right?
No, Randy! It is get away from her, you bitch. Your classmate was right, you knob. In fairness to Jamie Kennedy here, I have heard that during this take the classmate said the wrong line, and thinking on his feet so as to not stall the scene, Jamie Kennedy replied with the erroneous line to keep the scene going. After all, they could have used takes of dialogue from later in the sequence that they might have missed out on if Jamie had stopped. Not sure how or why this made it into the final cut though, but whatever, I'm not really offended, it's just a little odd. You could always argue though that it's a clever way of showing Randy isn't the expert on films he thinks he is, I suppose, and that this foreshadows his death when he makes the seemingly out of character horror movie mistake of backing up towards a darkened van. Like, I feel like that's exactly the kind of thing that Randy would shout at horror movie characters for, but hey, if the lad can't quote aliens, maybe he isn't quite the pop cultural font of knowledge we thought he is. Anyway, as the bodies pile up, it seems like the killer is out to make a real life sequel, with Sidney being the ultimate target. So it's up to Sidney and her few friends who can survive this second attack, RIP Randy, to get to the bottom of who this new copycat killer or killers are, all while being stalked and taunted by this mystery person along the way. And with so many suspects, like Sid's new boyfriend, the medical student whose attack from the killer conveniently missed every major artery, or the entitled Cotton, a face from Sid's past who wrongly served a year in prison for Sid's mother's murder on Sid's testimonial, or even her very friends she once knew she could rely on but who seem to have all converged on the area with a convenient excuse to be there just as the murders began, it won't be easy to know who to trust. It's a brilliant mystery that's engaging throughout and packed with a bunch of fun horror set pieces, like an excellent theatre scene where Ghostface blends with dramatic flair into the other masked performers, a great tense sequence of Gale being chased around the college after hours that plays with elements like soundproof glass, cameras, and an almost labyrinthine layout, and a nerve-shredding sequence where Sydney and Haley have to climb over the unconscious body of their would-be killer to get out of a crashed police car. The meta-commentary on the genre is once again richly on display, tackling a whole host of new concepts such as the nature of sequels, the ethics of cinematic violence and true crime, media scapegoating, and the pursuit of celebrity. Cotton's desperate and single-minded quest for building fame on the back of his and Sydney's trauma is a great new antagonistic force that ties into the film's ending and its themes in a compelling way. The killer's motives, though I won't reveal them because while not as great as the originals, are still thematically interesting, cleverly foreshadowed in all manner of fun tongue-in-cheek ways, and the reveal lands in a satisfying manner I think should probably be witnessed firsthand. Plus, the journey we take to get to this solid conclusion is once again bursting with great characters and dialogue that once more showcases Kevin Williamson's finger on the pulse mindset when it comes to writing horror and characters for a whole new generation. It's another smart, subversive, and deeply satirical look at a beloved but occasionally tired genre that continues Scream's trend of pumping new life into horror's old veins. And that's Scream 2. But here's the thing. This is an extremely solid slasher movie. Everything it does works. It's engaging, the characters are great, it still has that sharp meta commentary throughout. It's a good, fun film. However, for me, it commits one unfortunate cardinal sin. It follows Scream 1. It was always going to be impossible to make a film like Scream again, and although Scream 2 makes an incredibly earnest attempt and does enough with its new material and characters to keep audiences entertained and engaged throughout, the simple fact of the matter is that Scream was revolutionary and Scream 2 is not. It is an effect of that revolution, flames and smoke in the afterburn of it, not the spark that started it. It's like hearing the same joke twice. It could be the funniest thing you've ever heard the first time round, but it's never going to land quite as well that second time. There are many that argue it's actually the superior movie. And while I'm all for heaping critical praise on this thing, because I do think Scream 2 deserves its time in the spotlight, I gotta say, better than the first? I'm sorry, I just don't see that. The original Scream was as tight as could be. It's a straight up perfect movie. Its red herrings were super believable, its characters were great, its performances memorable, its opening iconic, its concept smart and unique, but most importantly, it was new. It's impossible for every meta horror that follows Scream's huge impact on the genre to not somehow exist in the shadow of this giant, and that applies to even its own sequels. Much like every slasher ever owes some debt of gratitude to Psycho and Peeping Tom, so does every meta horror have some Scream DNA. Yeah, Wes Craven's New Nightmare came out earlier and did similar things, but that took a far more surreal and artsy approach compared to Scream's very MTV but otherwise grounded in mainstream narrative. And sure, Jason Lives was doing the horror satire jokes even earlier than that and would itself be a huge influence on Kevin Williamson when he wrote Scream, but its meta commentary was relegated to the occasional witty line and fun wink at the audience rather than almost entirely its central conceit. No matter which way you cut it and no matter what came before it, Scream cemented itself as the beloved granddaddy of meta horror. It's the one that had the impact, it's the one that saved mainstream horror and made it palatable again to a wide audience. It's the one that had the huge influence on so much of the genre that followed. Let's not forget that we know the messy Jason X got notes back on its script saying to make it more like Scream. How many times do you think a script got notes back saying, hey, can we make this more like Wes Craven's New Nightmare? As great as that film was, I'm willing to bet the answer to that question is almost definitely none. I'm not saying Scream marks the subgenre as done and dusted. There are ways to make slasher and horror meta commentary fresh for sure. Leslie Vernon's 2006 mockumentary approach still felt wholly unique 10 years after Ghostface hit our screens, and I bloody love 2011's Cabin in the Woods, but even with those films, there's no denying they all owe a debt of gratitude to Ghostface's debut. And while those films can shine on their own merit, being that they're standalone titles from different creators that came out years later, Scream 2 always has the caveat of being the named connection and immediate sequel to that first movie. Every single recommendation of Scream 2 often comes with the additional comparison to its prior film. It's always, Scream 2 is great, you should definitely watch that. Not as good as Scream 1, but still really good. Does it do enough of its own thing to be considered a volume worth watching alongside that former film? Absolutely. Its skewering of horror sequels feels like the perfect companion piece to the former's twists, homages and subversions of slasher tropes. And there's so many more great unique things to point to that make this so much more than just the second Scream. The way it examines our relationship with horror movies by having an in-universe adaptation of the first film's incredible tragedies be a hugely popular hit is phenomenal stuff. Its discussion around the moral panics of media's responsibilities and scapegoating status when it comes to national tragedies, brilliant. Its unique horror set pieces, like the protagonists having to climb over an unconscious killer in the claustrophobic crashed car while contemplating whether to remove his mask and possibly disturb him and endanger themselves, awesome. Love it. The theatre performance was added in during rewrites, spine-tinglingly good. The mystery, the foreshadowing, the multiple red herrings, the new characters, the old characters who get new ways of being further fleshed out, it's all brilliant stuff. And it's all new and unique to this entry. The problem is, in amongst all of those noteworthy additions, is a lot of stuff that only on the second entry into this franchise still manages to feel a bit like a Scream tribute act. The big chilling opening sequence where a couple unrelated to the main cast are killed to set the tone and scene, it's great, but not as good as Scream 1's. The meta commentary on the various horror movie tropes, yeah, it's awesome. Not as good as when Scream 1 did it though. The central mystery and the final reveal of who the killers are, as well as the performance from the killers themselves, yeah, brilliant stuff. But no prizes for guessing what I'm going to say next. It's not as good as when Scream 1 did it. I honestly feel really bad comparing Scream 2 so unfavourably to that first film because it is really good. And in terms of thinking about Scream 2 as a slasher sequel, it is one of the best there is. Comparing it to every other second film I'm covering this month, that is to say Nightmare 2, Halloween 2 and Friday 2, Scream 2 is by far the superior film to all of those franchise entries, and it's honestly not even close. However, it has a problem they do not. Firstly, it's following one of the greatest horror films of all time. Unlike the second Friday the 13th, that film can get away with having a similar film again because it never had ambitions beyond forgettable popcorn escapism anyway. And Nightmare 2 and Halloween 2 may be hugely inferior step downs from their first entries, but they're also hugely different, so don't remotely invite those comparisons as much. Nightmare 2 took a totally different angle with a possession storyline, and Halloween 2 dropped the subtlety and tension building dread of its first film in favour of more gory popcorn fare. Scream 2 though is still very much a Scream film. For all its refreshingly unique elements, it can often feel like it's hitting the key beats of a formula. Despite only being the second movie to have that formula, it's still a whodunit with a two-killer reveal, it's still got the let's pause and talk about the rules moment, it's still got the Dewey and Gale romance, and it's still got the almost standalone short film-like structure to its pre-title sequence. To quote one of the first movie's villains, it's a Scream, baby. And maybe the problem is with me. I should, after all, judge it on its own merit. And I certainly do, to some extent. I'll say it time and time again, it's a really great film. I just can't help myself in drawing those comparisons because it often feels like the film is inviting them. Perhaps that's actually the smartest thing it does in the end. This film is, after all, poking fun at the idea of horror sequels. Maybe this is just another clever tool in its repertoire. As Randy puts it, in horror sequels, the body count is always bigger, the death scenes are always more elaborate, and it certainly hits those notes. Maybe this bigger, badder, but not quite better sequel is in itself the final skewering of the trend of the bigger, badder, but not quite better sequels of the past. Maybe. Or maybe it's just a really good film that isn't quite as good as the last one. I don't know, but what I do know is that you shouldn't let any of my negative comparisons colour your perception of it because Scream 2 still rules. Scream 3 is widely regarded as the worst in the Scream series, and I gotta say, if that's truly the case, then I'm of the opinion that there really isn't a bad Scream film at all. Scream 3 marks the first, and as of right now until the known to be in development Scream 5 releases next year, only Scream title not penned by series creator Kevin Williamson, due to him being tied to other commitments after absolutely blowing up in demand following the spectacular release of the first movie. Kevin had originally put a 5-page outline for 2 sequels into his original script in the hopes of selling studios on that sexy franchise potential. However, for whatever reason, while they'd been the basis for the second entry, the vast majority of those notes were thrown out for Scream 3, which was instead written by Ehren Kruger, who has a pretty damn weird resume, to be honest. Before Scream, he wrote a TV movie and a couple of decent thrillers, and then after, he went on to do the American remake of both The Ring and Ghost in the Shell, as well as Transformers 2, 3 and 4, the live-action Dumbo, and the upcoming Top Gun sequel. I don't know why this surprises me. They're all big IPs, and it makes sense that you jump someone with a track record of being able to handle profitable blockbusters between these kind of assignments. It's just very odd to me to look at The Ring and be like, oh yeah, he'd be great for Transformers 2 Revenge of the Fallen. That's not really relevant to his work on Scream 3, of course. I just find it interesting. As an additional point on the writing front, Kruger admits that although he never went credited as a writer, director Wes Craven also made huge contributions to the script in order to keep Williamson's established tone for the characters on the occasions where Kruger would veer a little off track. Side note, I absolutely love that Craven wrote a script for Scream with someone called Kruger. You know, like his creation, Freddy Krueger. I know the spelling of the surname is a little different, but that's still a fun little coincidence, right? Well, whatever, I think it's interesting. Going back to why we're here though, Kruger's plot once again follows recurring protagonist and top tier final girl, Sidney Prescott, who now at 22 years old has chosen to live a life in seclusion, working as a crisis counsellor for an abused women's hotline, but is forced to come back out of her seclusion when another killer finds her location and at any point in time threatens to strike. Originally intended to be the concluding chapter in the franchise, watching the film, it is obvious why this is considered the worst in the series. I don't think it's bad by any means, but its mystery isn't as compelling as Scream 1 and 2's, its revelations don't land as satisfyingly, the methods the killer uses require a great deal more suspension of disbelief, and overall, it's never as tense, scary, or violent as former entries. Though that latter divisive new choice of tone is by design. Releasing a whole 3 years after the prior film, a way bigger gap than the 1 year turnover between Scream 1 and 2, 3 unfortunately had to tackle with releasing in a very different America to the one the first 2 films released in. To be specific, Scream 3 was the very first massive mainstream slasher franchise title to be launched in the aftermath of the tragedies of the 1999 Columbine Massacre, an event that occurred only 2 months prior to the film's principal photography, causing the franchise to pivot its priorities in favour of a more comedic, at almost times bordering on very cartoony-like tone, due to the filmmakers and studio being worried about the public scrutiny and media scapegoating surrounding violent artistic content that was going on at the time. You know the shtick, it's surfaced every time there's a horrible act of violence with a decent amount of media coverage. It's forever the fault of whatever young people enjoy at the time. It's gotta be rock and roll, or comic books, or Dungeons and Dragons, or scary movies and video games. They're definitely the reason for all of society's ills. Obviously. It couldn't be anything else. I mean, it's definitely not that there's an issue with the lack of substantial and easily accessible mental health services or a predominant gun culture that can problematically clash with the motivational driving force of poisonous ideologies, including rampant misogyny, racism, or really any bigotry. It's definitely not venomous internet radicalization pushed by media corporations because hate clicks get lots of ad revenue. No! That's not what's at fault here. It's Doom 2. That's what did it. It's this little bastard. There he is, boys. Get him. Where's Superman? Go on, Superman. Get Doom 2. There you go. Well done. Put him in the Phantom Zone. Yeah, there we go. Congratulations, all. We've fixed society. Thanks, Superman. So yeah, not wanting to end up in the prison of media scapegoating that sprouted up from the intensely think of the children mindset permeating the American psyche following a high-profile national tragedy, more so than any of the other Scream films, there's a lot more goofs and gaffs and campy characters and mystery solving this time round. And the killer spends a lot more time tripping over things and genuinely kinda bumbling a lot more. Which lowers the stakes and scares a lot because it's all a bit Scooby-Doo. But here's the thing, ladies, gentlemen and envies. I loves me a Scooby-Doo. A Scooby-Dooby-Doo. I'm holding this shot. We're going to sit in that for a moment. We're not moving on. Take it in. Enjoy it. Also, I actually think in one specific way this film is aged in a very peculiar and interesting manner. But to explain that point, we need to talk a little bit more about the plot, so let's jump right into it. The film opens, as Scream films tend to do, with a big establishing scare and murder that's only really tangentially related to the main story. Set years after the events of Scream 2, Cotton Weary, the exonerated and fame-hungry man Sidney once falsely accused of murder and saw sent to prison, has finally got his time in the spotlight, using his story of newly realised innocence to fame hop into hosting a trashy but extremely highly viewed Jerry Springer-esque talk show called 100% Cotton. Love that. Brilliant. Perfect evolution of that character that is exactly where I expect him to be, and it's wrapped in a brilliant pun. High fives for everyone who thought of that one. While driving home, Cotton is contacted by a female fan who seemingly has the wrong number, and they flirt a little. However, once she has his attention, she reveals herself to be the newest Ghostface killer, using an admittedly crazy perfect voice modulator. Yeah, this comes up a lot in this film. Like, I know the voice modulation thing was used in past movies, but I could buy that because it always just made the killer sound like one specific voice. But apparently this film's Ghostface has upgraded to technology that we're only just figuring out now, as not only can it flawlessly transform their voice into that of a young woman, but also multiple other characters perfectly. Like on several occasions, Ghostface calls people pretending to be other members of the cast, and the voice changer is so perfect that they buy it. That's a bit of a plot convenience stretch. I don't know of many voice modulation systems that come with the non-famous and very specific people you interact with as perfect pre-installed presets. Little bit Scooby-Doo, but if you go with it and just buy into that concept, it's not like narrative breaking or anything, it's just a bit of an eye roll. Anyway, Ghostface antagonises Cotton and threatens to kill his girlfriend Christine if he doesn't give up the whereabouts of Sidney Prescott. He lets Cotton know he's in his home and watching his girlfriend, and after a big actiony race back and some mind games, the killer strikes. Despite all the Scooby-Doo stumbling around, this surprisingly still creates an effective and tense opener, thanks to the once again brilliant direction of Wes Craven. We end this sequence with the first two murders of a couple that every Scream so far has kicked off with, and then crash cut to a title card and shift focus to our main cast. Firstly, we meet new kid on the block, Detective Mark Kincaid, who's a great new addition. He's a solid suspect for the crimes and a pretty likeable and well-rounded character, although he does have the single worst line in the entire franchise.
Hey, Detective. What's your favorite scary movie?
My life.
I promise he's not always like this. He's the detective in charge of cracking the case behind the murders of Cotton and Christine. Not really knowing where to start, he contacts Courtney Cox's returning Gail Weathers, the opportunistic reporter who wrote the sensationalist book on her involvement in the original Ghostface killings. Sensing a scoop and maybe even wanting to help out, she travels to Hollywood where the murders took place, and her investigations take her to the set of Stab 3, where Cotton was set to make a cameo appearance. Stab 3, of course, being the newest entry into the lucrative slasher franchise that spawned from the back of her book. While on set, she bumps into old flame and returning cast character Deputy Dewey, who is advising on the film as a consultant and now shares a somewhat ambiguously close relationship with the actress playing Gail Weathers. You might notice at this point that despite this franchise being predominantly Sidney's story, that Gail and Dewey kind of do the heavy lifting for the first act, only occasionally cutting to Sidney miles away to establish her newly secluded living situation and new job as a crisis counsellor. This is actually a design by necessity, as actress Neve Campbell was only available for a period of 20 days due to other commitments, and the script had to change and lower her screen time to accommodate this. Credit to Craven and Kruger for making this pretty seamless though. Sidney's self-isolation and role as a crisis counsellor after what she's went through feels pretty natural a plot point. Anyway, as the film develops, the cast of Stab 3 start to get murdered one by one, specifically in the same order of the script, suggesting the killer is someone with insider knowledge. And often, they are dispatched in a lot more bloodless manners than the past, like this gas explosion. As the body count continues to rise and the killer manages to find Sidney, our returning final girl gets the gang back together for some good old mystery solving. They even find a fun way to bring murdered fan favourite Randy back, as he gets a fun cameo in a new newly surfaced pre-recorded tape he made before his death, where he waxes poetically once more about slasher tropes to help our heroes from beyond the grave. That's cute. I like that. With every death, the killer leaves a mysterious clue of a black and white picture of Maureen Prescott, Sydney's dead mother, though specifically images of her in her younger years. And our protagonists quickly realise that these pictures are of her right here in Hollywood. And this is where the film gets pretty interesting. Remember that this film came out in the year 2000 when I say this next bit. So Sydney finds out that her mother had a brief acting career under the wing of Stab franchise producer John Milton. They confront John about this knowledge of Maureen and why he didn't come forward with this information when the killer was leaving all these photos. John admits that he knew Maureen briefly, that she was an aspiring actress who he, like he does with most of his female talent, had arranged for to attend a party with various influential men. A system he claimed to be a staple in Hollywood that would see girls given ample opportunities so long as they were willing to make the right impression. He goes on to elaborate that things may have gotten out of hand with these men, but says that Maureen knew what she was getting in for, and if she couldn't handle that heat, to get out of Hollywood, because if you want to get ahead, you gotta play the game. He ends this disgusting monologue with the chilling line, "Nothing happened to her that she didn't invite in one way or another, no matter what she said afterwards." I don't think I need to spell out what's going on here. This film calls out Harvey Weinstein. Well, I will say not Harvey specifically, and not just one person in general, but this film directly draws attention to and spotlights the open secret of the casting couch culture of Hollywood, long before a general public ever had any knowledge about it. It is not relegated to this moment as well, it's a straight up thematic thread. Gale Weathers' Stab actress Jennifer makes a remark regarding a relationship with her producer. Angelina, the young, quiet and shy actress debuting as Sydney Prescott before her death, cries out after the film goes under that she can't believe she slept with that pig John Milton to get the role. And Carrie Fisher, in a very meta cameo where she plays a Carrie Fisher lookalike, remarks that she was also up for Princess Leia, but of the two almost twin-like performers, the one who got the part was the one willing to sleep with George Lucas. The revelations and multiple accusations against Weinstein wouldn't surface in the public eye for another 17 years, and seemingly no one really batted an eye at this subplot back in the year 2000s. Perhaps worryingly, this points to how accepted it was. Or maybe we were just naive and didn't fully comprehend the problem this was pulling from here as anything other than a fictional urban legend played for cheap horror. But watching it now, knowing all we know, this shit is like uncomfortable. And not uncomfortable in a bad way, like it should feel uncomfortable, but just like, how did this make it in here? It half feels like a warning we should have paid more attention to. Granted, it's a fairly clunky warning. It comes in the form of a subplot of a critically middling third entry into a slasher franchise, and Maureen Prescott and many other women are slut-shamed way too often in this series by other characters for it to firmly be on the right side of things. Though granted, this shaming is often from the mouths of villainous characters, and in this film at least, this ideology does seem to be depicted as poisonous. However, it's just a little messy in its delivery when you're exposing this culture in one scene and then having characters joke about it in passing in the next. And that's already pretty messy before we even get into the semantics of the film being made under the Dimension Films banner, which was a subsidiary of the Weinstein Brothers Miramax company at the time, so it was technically making money for arguably one of this culture's biggest problematic elements. Granted, Dimension Films was more the brainchild of brother Bob Weinstein, who wanted to focus on genre films, while Harvey was more hands-on with the Miramax label doing the more prestige flicks, but still, that connection is a little complicated. Not that I think they shouldn't have been making these statements under a Weinstein banner. If anything, if that's the platform you've got and you can get away with it, that's probably where you should be shouting about it the loudest. But it's also kind of depressing that Harvey was apparently so comfortable in his seat of abusive power that he didn't step in any way and ask these references to be removed, even though he had made input on Dimension film productions outside of this. Maybe he was too busy and didn't know, maybe he just didn't care. But either way, the fact that this was so open a secret in Hollywood even 17 years before the big New York Times expose that a screenwriter who barely even had any large experience in the industry could make it a plot point and comment on it is depressingly telling. I don't know how I feel about this theme's inclusion. I'm not opposed to people using the platforms given to them by bad, powerful people to call out those same bad, powerful people, even when it makes those bad people money. You have to use whatever platform you've got that has the biggest reach to the most eyes and ears sometimes. And coded language in Scream 3 was going to be seen by a lot of people, where say whichever person that had put this in, be it Craven, Kruger, or an artifact left over from Williamson's notes, had they put this in a more blunt and open manner on say a random blog post somewhere, it's likely no one would have read it, the powers that be would have seen it buried in the blink of an eye with threats of libel court cases, and they'd probably never have worked again. But still, it is a little unsettling that this is a subplot in a fun slasher satire, isn't it? There's every possibility this wasn't even intended to spotlight anything and was just something sensationalist to throw in the plot. In the end, I guess I'm not saying it's bad, I'm not saying it's good, I'm just saying it's extremely noteworthy. Complicated as its inclusion may be, and as many reasons as we can speculate as to why it was included aside, the fact of the matter is, it's there, it's very central to the film's conceit, and it's kind of surprising and definitely worth discussing. The rest of the film, unfortunately, or I guess maybe fortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, isn't anywhere near as noteworthy. We get some more killer hijinks, and the final reveal falls completely flat for me. For the previous two Scream videos, I didn't reveal the final twist as I thought they were good enough that they should be seen by anyone who hadn't watched them firsthand, but in order to criticise this one, I kinda have to spell it out, so spoilers if you're bothered about that, but it's not a great twist anyway. The killer is revealed to be Stab 3's director Roman, who it turns out is the secret brother to Sydney, born from her mother's time in Hollywood, presumably from the traumatic events that caused her to leave and give him up for adoption. Mad at his mother's absence from his life, Roman takes revenge on her by, in a really crappy retcon, being the secret mastermind behind the first film's murders, and now he's jealous of Sydney's fame or something, so he plans to frame her for the murders. Not my bag. Secret familial relationships to me feels like the kind of thing this film should be satirizing, not playing straight. It feels like the kind of lazy horror twist that Once Upon a Time Scream would make fun of. And here, it's the big final reveal. It's just a bit of a misfire. Anyway, after that flat note, the heroes kill Roman, we wrap up the romance between Dewey and Gale by having Dewey propose, and the film ends with a little note where Sydney is shown to feel comfortable and safe in her own home. And we leave our beloved characters on a nice, happy ending. So yeah, all in all, not bad. A bit Scooby-Doo perhaps, but that's not the worst thing. Craven's direction still gives us a decent degree of scary, even when his hands are tied to a less bloody and more comedic tone, and now our characters get a deserving send-off on what was supposed to be the final film. Not the best Scream, as many will point out, but by no means as bad as its reputation sometimes suggests it to be. Its tone isn't so goofy as to be off-putting a la Freddy's Dead, and although its mystery is never quite as good and it's never quite as scary and never quite as sharp in its metatextual satire, it's still an enjoyable ride with lovable characters. Plus, no matter which way you slice it, whether you love it, hate it, or anything in between, there's no denying that the Weinstein-esque subplot and theme is really something. Whether it's a good something or not, I'm not certain, but it's worth the discussion it sparks, and I think regardless of whether it was meant as any kind of commentary, and even if it was well-intentioned or simply sensationalist, it does shine a light on an uncomfortable truth behind the scenes of a powerful industry. And as messy and Scooby-Dooey as the film may be, that's worth reassessing. Scream 4 is a fun movie. It's not the revolution that Scream 1 was, it's not as good a sequel as Scream 2, and it doesn't have the strangely still heavily topical elements of Scream 3. But what it does have is a smooth sub-2-hour runtime that absolutely flies by. And while lacking the bite of some of its predecessors, it more than makes up for it with great characterization, a steady stream of self-referential humour and spatterings of snappy meta-commentary, a surprisingly pretty well-aged early analysis on the effects of social media on the wider culture at large, some great set pieces, and a new cast who slot in seamlessly with their older returning counterparts. While Scream 3 intended to close out the trilogy, much like every other horror, the franchise was never truly dead. With most of its original cast still surviving, and now an environment of reboot culture ripe for riffing on, it made a lot of sense conceptually to bring the franchise back. More importantly for studios though, all three Scream films made bank. Every one of them was a bona fide mega hit, especially for slasher films. Even the more critically divisive third entry, They all held #1 positions at the box office during their runs, and they all turned around over $100 million more than their budgets. The surprising thing about this film isn't that we got a Scream 4 after the series had quote-unquote ended. The surprising part is that we had to wait over a decade for it. Other slasher series in the past that had ended, such as Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street, waited a few years at most before introducing a new franchise entry. We should honestly thank our lucky stars that we don't have like 8 Scream films now, each one slowly degrading the series in quality, becoming further and further removed from its original material until it becomes some unrecognisable ghost face shaped husk churned out on the yearly that only stops when it becomes so milked for all it's worth that audiences lose interest in it entirely. It's particularly baffling that this didn't happen, since the reason for Scream 4's eventual release was pretty much just, it makes money, let's do another one. Like, there was no real other reason for it. Often, long dormant franchise film continuations spur from an actual catalyst, like a rights renewal, or a creative conversation, or a performer's newly revitalised career. Halloween 2018, for example, came about because Carpenter was unhappy with the remake's portrayal of Michael Myers and wanted to do something with him. So he and Blumhouse actively seek to attain the film rights back, and filmmakers and Halloween fans David Gordon Green and Danny McBride approached Carpenter after this because they thought they had a really great idea, and that conversation spurred the film. With Scream 4 though, there wasn't anything like this. There was no incredible script floating around Hollywood that made people want to dust off the old IP. There was no huge demand for it, at least no more than there is for any other fan favourite horror franchise that lays dormant. It wasn't made as a particular reaction to a changing world or recent news story. It wasn't cashing in on any particular fad of nostalgia, like how nowadays we're bringing back a bunch of 80s properties. Previous films hadn't had a sudden surge in re-interest, and it certainly wasn't striking while the iron was hot. Literally, the only reason it exists, as far as I can find, is just because the Weinstein Company, yeah I know, said it would. In 2008, they announced that a Scream 4 would be made. More specifically, it was Bob Weinstein's idea. He apparently just thought it was time for another one. Whether that was Scream 4 or a remake was still yet to be decided. There was no script. Series creator Kevin Williamson, to my knowledge as far as I can find, was not yet attached, and if he was, he definitely only had an outline, as director Wes Craven would later say that's all that was developed when they called and asked him if he'd be interested in discussing it. Which of course also means that Wes definitely wasn't on board until after the announcement too, which isn't actually too ridiculous. Big intellectual property films are planned for release all the time before they decide on who's attached to the project. I only bring this up here to point out that they obviously presumably intended for this film to happen with or without Craven and Williamson's involvement. Luckily for us though, they both signed on, and I'm especially grateful for this, not just because I love what they did with it, but also because, while I can't be sure of this, I expect that we'd have went down the remake route if Williamson hadn't came to Bob with an idea he liked, since that shit was all the rage in the 2000s and 2010s. I do think there could have been some merit in remaking a film like Scream, which was originally a meta takedown of the tropes of the slasher genre while being a slasher itself, in that it could have actually been interesting as a remake that self-referentially mocked remakes. Perhaps it could have even revolutionised the idea of remakes and reboots in the way that the original revolutionised its horror subgenre. I just don't think this could have been pulled off without an incredible team and script and full studio backing willing to take the risks and not interfere. And remakes are often by definition very risk averse. A continuation was always my preferred option, and thankfully, though you'd expect it to go the other way, a continuation is exactly what we got. And for my money, it's a pretty damn good one. The film opens with one of the most fun meta gags of the entire series, one that arguably even pokes fun at the series' own use of meta gags by intentionally taking it to ridiculous levels. It's the 15th anniversary of the original Woodsboro murders, and 2 young girls in a quick establishing sequence are murdered by Ghostface. But surprise! That didn't happen, it's just a scene from Stab 6, the in-universe film series that adapted the events of the Woodsboro murders and character Gale Weathers' book on them into a multimedia franchise. Fun little fake out. This scene from Stab 6 is being watched by these 2 characters during a movie night, who then argue over the series' quality when all of a sudden, BAM! It escalates into one suddenly stabbing the other for interrupting her movie experience, and title card. That was Stab 7. The characters were watching Stab 6 in the movie, which was Stab 7. Well played film, I enjoyed that, nicely done. We're then introduced to our first real victims, Jenny and Marnie, who are the ones watching Stab 7 on the 15th anniversary of the original murders that film franchise spawned from, and who even humorously reference how the opening sequence we just saw doesn't really make much sense. The two goof around and prank one another until, surprise surprise, in what is now our third opening sequence involving a sudden murder, they are killed by Ghostface, kicking off the events of the real movie. Sidney Prescott, cinema's most successful final girl, having survived the attacks of 5 different killers over 3 preceding films, is now an accomplished self-help author and is revisiting her old small town of Woodsboro, the site of the first film's attacks, as the next stop on her book tour. Also here is returning Deputy Dewey, now Sheriff Dewey, who seems to be enjoying his time as the big fish man in charge of this small pond, and his wife, fearless but ruthless reporter Gail Weathers, now Gail Weathers Riley, who originally wrote the book on the Woodsboro murders after her first-hand involvement and played a huge part in uncovering the mysteries behind the next 2 Ghostface murders, but is now losing her tenacity and bite, feeling both trapped by her small town surroundings she's committed to living in with her husband, as well as the massive burden of terrible writer's block as she tries to put her past life behind her and write fiction. Now before I go on, can I just say that, man, Kevin Williamson fucking knows these characters inside and out, doesn't he? I know he didn't write Scream 3, so I'll not give him credit for some of the natural evolutions of character stories that occurred in that film, like Sidney working for a crisis hotline for women, but even still, every single thing these characters do are so pitch perfect as to who they are. Like, every time I see them. Sidney's ending in 3, feeling comfortable and safe in putting the trauma behind her, then being developed here into her writing an autobiography / self-help book in vast contrast with Gail Weathers' exploitative sensationalist novel, is such a banger idea. Dewey becoming sheriff and relishing in feeling important, Gail struggling with the quiet life and forcing herself into this film's events after seeing Sidney on TV being successful in promoting her new book and arguably getting a little jealous, it's all so spot on. 10 years later from when we last saw them, this is exactly where these characters should be and exactly what they should be doing. It's so cool and so unusual for a slasher franchise that we're able to follow these recurring characters as they age in real time. This, I feel, is a really under-celebrated aspect of the Scream franchise, and one that sets it apart from probably all other slasher series. Scream is so heavily character based. So many slashers just cycle their cast like they're expendable, and if anyone does come back they tend to be killed off fairly quickly or only appear for 1 or 2 extra films. But Scream has multiple people, all brilliantly realised from their very first appearance, that grow and develop and age throughout the years of the franchise's existence. It is so cool to watch Sidney, a character you already love, literally grow. Depending on your age when you watch the first movie, there's every chance you're physically growing up alongside her. It's really cool. I love how everything about these characters evolves, from their professions, to their fashion, to their personalities. It grounds everything with such a strong human foundation. Cannot sing this creative decision's praises enough. Anyway, enough celebrating our old cast, it's time to meet the new blood. When the murders of the opening are reported in, Dewey asks Sidney to stay in town while the investigation unfolds, after a search of her rental car reveals some pretty sus materials. This leaves Sidney staying with her young cousin from the area, newly introduced character Jill, played by Scream Queen Emma Roberts of American Horror Story fame. Jill and her friends Kirby and Olivia, as well as her cheating ex-boyfriend Trevor and a couple of film geeks from their school, Charlie and Robbie, pad out the film's main newcomers. And naturally, as Kevin Williamson characters tend to be in this franchise, they're all great. Believably teenage, sharp and witty, and written with a great deal of care and a topical flair. I particularly like the film nerds. They're basically this film's Randy. They give good reason for the Stab franchise to keep coming up as a plot point and give us all the nice meta set pieces and fun commentary. And as avid bloggers, they're one of the film's aspects that has aged the best. They've got this social media vlogging obsession and live stream pretty much everything, which, as we know, has really picked up as a trend, especially amongst this age group with the rise of Twitch since this film's release in 2011. En route to school, Jill and her friends reveal to one another that they've been getting creepy Ghostface phone calls, which is only the start of their worries, as later Kirby and Jill receive another phone call that warns them about a man hiding in the closet. With a nice little build of tension, the two open the closet to find nothing, only for the killer on the phone to reveal he never said it was their closet he was hiding in. And they look on in horror as he emerges in the room of their friend across the road and proceeds to murder her. Sidney and Jill rush to her aid, but they're too late and Jill is cut by the killer in the process, before he escapes. After they're treated at the hospital, Sydney's agent Rebecca on her book tour suggests exploiting the current murders for book sales, to which Sydney responds to by firing her. Leaving the hospital in a sulk, Rebecca finds herself in a horror cliche, trapped in an empty car park, no one around to help, and oh no, her car won't start. Kevin, come on dude, you're better than that. What is this, a Friday the 13th movie? This is the kind of scene you used to make fun of. I'm not saying it's bad or anything, it might be a bit cliche, but it's effectively handled under Craven's well-experienced direction. But aside from the darkly comic ending of her falling onto a news van in the middle of a conference taking place below, where Dewey is assuring everyone things are under control, this whole sequence is played very straight for a franchise that made its name on cleverly subverting this particular brand of scene. Thankfully, the immediate following scene adds back in a bit more of that Scream flair. Doing her own little investigating, Gail goes to the school and enlists the help of the resident film nerds, who theorise that the killer is remaking the first movie, drawing parallels between the current victims and the original victims. This also gives Williamson a fun excuse to wax lyrical about how the horror genre has developed and changed since the 90s, and poke fun at the reboot-heavy culture of horror now. Side note, Rory Culkin is extremely good in this. Maybe it's because he just looks and sounds like a film nerd already, but he's really good at playing these sort of cool, sort of dweeby weirdos. Which reminds me, every time I see this guy, I want to make a video on the black metal biopic movie he was in called Lords of Chaos, which is a film that I absolutely loved, but that seemingly no one else watched. And those few who did not like it. I think it's good though. I should really get on that at some point. Anyways, the film goes on in much the same way as you'd expect it to. Bodies pile up, red herrings are ruled out, the killer gets their big reveal, and it all plays out very well. It's totally solid stuff. I suppose it is just a tiny disappointing that it plays so close to the formula, since Scream as a franchise's whole shtick when it's at its strongest is to subvert expectations and do something new. It's kind of a slight letdown when a fresh new entry 10 years later ultimately retreads very similar plot beats. They could have done something completely out of left field, like have the killer be one of the established cast members. Maybe Gail really needed to feel a little bigger than being trapped in this small town and chose a very dark path to get over her writer's block. I'm not saying that's a great, well thought out idea or anything, I'm just saying I would have liked the movie to really surprise and shock me with something different the way that that first film did. But ultimately, and I am about to spoil this here because I do want to talk about it, so you've been warned, spoilers coming in 3, 2, 1. There's two killers again. Much like the reveal of the first two films. One reveals that they were the real mastermind and just using their accomplice before killing them, just like in Scream 2, and of course, they are two of the new characters introduced for this film, namely Jill and Charlie. I do like their motivations, to be fair. They're both obsessed with fame and want to be this generation's Sydney and Randy, so they plan to frame Jill's ex for the attacks, kill him, and then act like they were the only ones who survived his massacre. Jill hated living in her cousin's shadow and wanted her own time in the spotlight, and this all connects very well into the commentaries and critiques of social media and the fame-obsessed generation it has created. Granted, when spelled out like that, it's a bit boomery. It's a little old man shouts at clouds, but it doesn't come across as super preachy or anything. Like the other film dork who's just super into live streaming and blogging, he ends up being totally innocent, and all of his social media obsession isn't really explored as some deep-seated problem with the youth of today. It's just a genuine way for him to express his interests in film, and you gotta remember, this was 2011. This was nowhere near as oversaturated and eye-rolling concept as it is now. We're talking long before those nauseating, phone-blaming and boomer-friendly art pieces you see all over Facebook ran with this concept at its least nuanced and most base level for 10 years and drove any conversations around this subject matter into the ground. This is long before the likes of that awful, and I cannot stress this enough, awful documentary The Social Dilemma, which for some reason trended hard despite being absolutely garbage. Man, I missed the boat on making a video on how badly researched and manipulative that shit was, and now that its whole phase has passed, I don't want to give it any more spotlight, but let me tell you, I hate that film so much. But Scream 4, on the other hand, was doing this stuff at a time when these observations weren't exactly uncharted territory as far as discussions go, but was still fairly new as thematic elements in major media. And here, it wasn't done in anywhere near as condescending a manner as it would devolve into over the next several years. The film even has what I would consider a pretty strong closing punch. After Jill kills Charlie because, as she puts it, the media really loves a sole survivor and she'll be way more famous if she doesn't have to share her glory, she actually manages to best Sydney, and then proceeds to beat the shit out of herself so she looks the part and seemingly gets everything just right. That is, until she finds out when she wakes up in hospital that Sydney survived her wounds and is recovering. There's a great bit before the final confrontation where Dewey works out she's the killer at the last minute, when Jill half jokes and half is shown to be already planning to capitalise on her newfound fame, when she makes a remark that Gail should help her write her upcoming book about all this, and that they've already got something in common with the matching scar placements, after Ghostface stabbed Gail in an earlier scene. The placement of the inflicted wound being something only the killer would know about. And as the eventual climax hits with Jill slowly losing her so close to winning hand, the three heroes, Sydney, Gail and Dewey, finally manage to best her, and after she dies in a fun and grisly fashion, we cut to outside the hospital where there's already a huge media scrum, salivating and hero worshipping Jill as the sole survivor of the most recent Ghostface attacks, essentially proving her point. A solid little closing punchline that does a good job of examining the predictability of the media's bloodthirsty approach to finding the best sensationalist angles in violent tragedies. On the nose, sure, a lot of stuff in this film feels that way now, but again, this was 2011. It was less eye-rolling then. And let's not pretend that when Black Mirror started airing later in the year and made these same observations, we didn't as a culture all collectively spooge at how revolutionary it was. And you know, with or without this little extra layer of social commentary, Scream 4 is still just a fun-ass film. It's got some great lines, some good comedy, a lot of fun throwbacks. It's just a damn good time. Yeah, your mileage may vary on how much you enjoy its takedowns of social media culture, depending on how much you've been talking to your technophobic uncle lately, but its genre critiques still make for fun observations whenever they crop up. And honestly, it's worth the price of admission just to check in with Kevin Williamson's truly great characters, and Wes Craven's directing on these things is always guaranteed to have some nice highs throughout. I'm really glad that he got to make this one last big hit before his tragic passing. It might not be the best work of his filmography, but it's great that his last film in Hollywood was working with a cast and writer he loved on a franchise he'd helmed the whole way through, and for my money, it's still a banger. Better than its predecessor, and a nice little return to a lot of the things that made the franchise fun in the first place. When I first did Wholesome Halloween Slasher Season, Scream was only a 4-film franchise, with a new entry still over a year away. Since then, there's actually been 2 more films, with a 7th known to be on the way. Now, I've already covered Scream 6, which ruled by the way, and I can't cover Scream 7 since at the time of this recording not even so much as a trailer for it exists yet, but it seems amongst my busyness I missed doing a video on the 5th entry. And since it's technically a reboot, it very much falls in the coverage of this miniseries. So let's take a look at it! Scream 5, and yes, I'm going to call it Scream 5 because, come on, it's Scream 5, was the series' first return to the big screen in 11 years. Calling itself simply Scream, even though, again, it's Scream 5, the film was billed as a reboot, but that's not entirely the right descriptor to give it. While it was a fresh start for the series after over a decade of dormancy, unlike the traditional concept of reboots, Scream 5 keeps its prior continuity. In a standard reboot, a studio will dust off an old IP to bring it back to life with a totally new cast, direction and continuity. This would be stuff like how Batman Begins completely ignores all of the Tim Burton era stuff to launch a new Batman series with a different tone and style, one disconnected from everything that came prior. Sometimes a simple straight remake can also be a reboot, such is the case if we stay in the horror world of Platinum Dune's 2003 Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake, which, while a remake of that first film, also rebooted the franchise with a new slate of continuity, getting its own prequel movie with both of those films connected to each other, but neither film connected to the originals except in terms of franchise name. Scream 5, on the other hand, though it is just titled Scream as if it's beginning again, actually sits more in the less used realm of the requel, an intended reboot of the franchise, but one that acts as a sequel to the events of those prior films. It could also be called a legacy sequel. Everything that happened in Scream 1 to 4 still occurred in the world of this movie. Characters return, stories continue, and while a new cast is present and a huge focus, they are interwoven with the old cast seamlessly. It might not have the number after it, but this is absolutely a direct sequel to Scream 4. And it's even followed up by a film called Scream 6. So if anyone wants to get pedantic and say, actually, it's just Scream, not Scream 5, I'm sorry to inform you, but you are fighting a losing battle. Directed by Tyler Gillette and Matt Bettinelli-Olpin, Scream 5 marks the very first film in the series not directed by Wes Craven after his death in 2015, giving the duo some very big shoes to fill. Thankfully, they do have the aid of Neve Campbell, David Arquette, Courtney Cox, and Roger L. Jackson returning to their roles as Ultimate Final Girl Sidney Prescott, good old Heart of Gold himself Dewey Riley, sensationalist reporter Gail Weathers, and the twisted voice for whoever's behind Ghostface this time, respectively. Joining them for this outing is two new leads, estranged sisters Tara, portrayed by Jenna Ortega, and Sam, portrayed by Melissa Barrera, as well as a new supporting cast of friends in Sam's boyfriend Richie, played by Jack Quaid, and Tara's friends Wes, played by Dylan Minnette, Amber, played by Mikey Madzian, twins Chad and Mindy, Mason Gooding and Jasmine Savoy Brown respectively, and Liv, portrayed by Sonia Ben-Ammar. The film begins with what feels like a throwback to the very first movie. Tara is at home alone when she receives a call from someone doing the creepy Ghostface voice who asks her to answer a bunch of horror trivia questions, starting with, "What's your favourite scary movie?" Tara answers The Babadook, which is a perfectly fine pick, but she does also refer to it as elevated horror. So, not saying she deserves to die, but could be a little less pompous about it. That's all I'm saying. The film immediately gets into the Scream metatextuality the series is known for by name-dropping a bunch of horror movies like It Follows, The Witch, and Hereditary, all bangers, and then having all the trivia questions be about the Stab franchise, Scream's in-universe retellings of its in-world Ghostface massacres. Tara gets the last question wrong, though I'll be honest, I feel like the Ghostface here kind of cheated her on that one with misleading phrasing. He asks who the killer, singular, was in the first Stab movie. Tara says Billy Loomis, but the killer points out there were actually two and she forgot Stu. Again, not the victim blame, dude was snidey in his wording, but Stu is the best character in this whole franchise, so maybe she should die? Tara survives the attack and her friend calls her estranged sister Sam. Though the two haven't been in touch for a while, the thought of almost losing her sends Sam right back to her sister's side. Her and her boyfriend Richie drive to the hospital, and while staying with her, it is revealed that Sam has hallucinations of OG Scream killer Billy Loomis. Unfortunately, my boy Matthew Lillard isn't standing behind him hugging him for these hallucinations, so I think it's safe to assume that's why she's so upset about these episodes. I'd be disappointed to not see Stu too. After another hallucination, Sam is attacked by Ghostface. Interestingly, during a call with the killer, Sam suggests that the killer come get her, to which the killer replies, "with pleasure," and seemingly bursts from behind the door. Now what's cool about this is if that were the killer on the phone, Sam would have totally heard them speaking into their phone like a foot away from her. It could be that it's an oversight from the creative team, but I choose to believe that this is actually clever foreshadowing, showing that there is at least definitively two killers, because someone else is making the call. After the attack, Sam becomes nervous for Tara's safety, and when there's a murder outside of a bar her friend group were hanging out at, tensions rise even further. With everything going on, Sam decides to come clean to her sister as to why she became estranged all those years ago. Turns out they're actually only half-sisters. As Sam found out, her real biological father was none other than the man living in her head, Mr. Billy Loomis. Sam and Richie decide they need the help of an expert and so seek out legacy character Dewey, who is now divorced from Gail, out of the police force, and seems to be in a pretty bad way about it. Though reluctant to help them at first, Dewey does eventually join their investigation and also informs Sydney and Gale that there's a new ghost face about town. Dewey, Sam and Tara's friend group all gather to discuss potential suspects, theorising that the killer is someone in this circle of people. Though everyone has suspicion cast on them for one reason or another, a general consensus seems to form that Sam has the most chance of being dodgy, simply because of her association with her dad. It's during this conversation we get very meta as Mindy, the niece of horror film geek Randy, who died in Scream 2 and shares a lot of that same passion her uncle does, theorises that the new killers are making a requel. The new Hollywood trend of making not quite a sequel, not quite a reboot. Something that combines a new cast with legacy characters to reinvigorate interest while still satisfying the fan base, like Star Wars or Halloween. And of course, she is right on the money, as what follows is exactly that. All of the traditional Scream whodunit antics wrapped up in a meta-commentary on the nature of the requel trend, in a kind of passing of the torch movie that sees the old cast unite with the new to try and survive the newest killer, or killers, find out the identity of who is doing all of this, and maybe even put a stop to it. Scream 5 is such a solid movie. Both a really fun throwback to the early days of the franchise and a decent chunk of its own thing, and it wraps it up in a discussion on the very currently relevant topic of toxic fandom. It triples down on the meta shtick that made the series famous, giving us scenes wrapped in so many layers of meta that it becomes ridiculous, and then loops back round into being perfectly comical. A great example of this would be a moment in which Randy Meek's niece is watching the first Stab movie while drunk. She gets to a scene that's a recreation of a moment from the first Scream film where an actor plays her uncle during the moment he drunkenly watches a scary movie and yells at the people on screen to look behind them, while Ghostface stands behind him. And now his niece watches that recreation while also drunkenly telling her fake uncle to look behind him while Ghostface is behind her. We're talking maybe 4 layers of meta at least there, and it makes for a really fun level of overkill. In another meta move, the killer's motivations are also revealed to be entirely tied to this franchise too, which is where the toxic fandom commentary comes in. The entire reason for these kills being just so studios hopefully have better source material to pull from when they make the next Stab film, because the 8th entry was apparently a massive disappointment. We get a lot of sort of fan culture stuff woven in throughout the film, name drops of Reddit, the horror subreddit and 4chan. We get a look at the kind of angry YouTube culture that surrounds these topics, with a video demanding Stab 8 be redone, featuring cameos from James and Chelsea of Dead Meat fame. It's all very topical without feeling shoehorned in. Another strength of the film is that for the most part the legacy characters are treated really well. Sydney, Gale and Dewey all feel like they have a natural reason to be there, and their inclusion often leads to big emotional payoffs at key points in the movie, but their presence never overshadows the new main cast. I think if there was anything to criticise about the film, it's that it might actually play it a little bit too safe. Legacy stuff is great fan service and all, but opening with a near carbon copy of the Drew Barrymore scare, and having the plot contrive a way to have the third act take place entirely in Stu's house from the original movie, feels a little bit too much like the film is resting on its laurels. And one legacy character's inclusion who I don't think works at all is the inclusion of Billy Loomis as a hallucination. I get he's an iconic part of the franchise, but I'm just not sure what he adds here. Sam could be his daughter without the strange hallucination stuff and still come under the same scrutiny from everyone around her. And also, his existence in her head kind of becomes a point of heroism at the end, which... I don't know about that one, guys. Billy to me from the original film was always coded as a very misogynistic, almost incel-like villain, and having that character sort of save the day in the end by passing on his violent ways to his biological daughter feels really at odds with his character and the commentary on toxic fandom that runs throughout the narrative. If you've watched any of the first Scream film, you know for a fact if that character were alive today, he'd be the one on the forums sending death threats to the actresses in Stab 8 for ruining his favourite franchise. And while I know it's not actually the character and it's in Sam's head, it's still weird to see someone who looks like Billy and acts like Billy push all of his violent tendencies onto his daughter and have that be the correct thing? You can argue that this is kind of her narrative arc of coming to terms with her past and embracing a part of her she tries to hide from, but it doesn't work for me. Now, I do know that they fixed this issue in Scream 6 by having her defy this voice inside her head, but like, that movie didn't exist when this one came out, so I still think this is an issue. Other than these gripes though, the film is just a really solid good time. So solid in fact, I'm actually struggling to find things to say about it, which might have been why I skipped doing a video on it the first time round. It doesn't light the world on fire or anything, and in my opinion it's nowhere near as strong as its follow-up, but it's still a super fun fanservicey whodunit mystery with a nice bit of paranoia and a good amount of potential suspects entertained in its runtime. It's got some nice twists and keeps you guessing to the end, and while nowhere near as revolutionary as the early films it pays homage to, it's a great legacy sequel that carries on the efforts of what those films did in the modern day. Not as strong as the strongest efforts, but not as weak as the weakest. Scream 5, and yes, it should be called Scream 5, so much so they even make a joke about that in the movie, is further proof that, at least for now, there is no such thing as a bad Scream movie.
Man, Scream 6 is a banger. I had every feeling I was going to enjoy Scream 6 going into it. Even putting aside my personal fandom for the series and love of the genre, it's a franchise that continually turns out movies that have a consistently high quality to them. As I mentioned in my review of Scream 3 back during Wholesome Halloween 2, while that was clearly the series' weakest point, even at its lowest, the saga still had interesting things to say about films and the industry, and still wrapped that up in an entertaining slasher package that showed a clear respect for its characters. And that surprisingly continued even into the reboot/sequel territory of the, in my opinion, very underrated Scream 4, as well as its second comeback 11 years later with last year's Scream 5. It's really something worth pointing out, as not many slasher sagas can say that 5 movies deep they were continuing to hit the still good target. Even the cult icons that inspired this meta-slasher series, Jason, Freddy, Leatherface and Michael Myers, certainly can't make that claim, because my god did their stories have some stinky rest stops along the journey to their 5th film milestone. But not only did Scream clear this hurdle, but here we are now at number 6, and honestly, I don't know if this is a hot take, but Scream 6 is legit one of my absolute favourites in the whole franchise. To get you up to speed real quick, Scream 6 takes place 1 year after the Scream 5 Woodsboro killings. Sam and Tara Carpenter, our new series protagonists introduced in that 2022 outing and portrayed by Melissa Barrera and internet's current newest obsession Jenna Ortega respectively, have moved to New York with their fellow survivor friends to study at Blackmore University, far away from the location of their past trauma. Unfortunately, trauma seems to have followed them. Sam is psychologically struggling and seeking out professional help from a therapist who straight up just doesn't know what to do with her, and Tara is doing her best to move on, but in a manner that very much feels like she's incapable of addressing or even really acknowledging what they went through, lying about who she is and where she comes from to classmates, and refusing to accept any of her sister's protection. Without warning, a new Ghostface killer shows up in their lives, and thanks to a stolen driving license placed at the scene of one of the killer's brutal murders, as well as an unfriendly media presence surrounding Sam and a Reddit conspiracy theory that paints her as the true mastermind behind the recent Woodsboro massacre, Tara and Sam are persons of interest in the crime and unable to flee the city, leaving them and their friends stuck in the labyrinthine concrete jungle of Manhattan to be stalked by this vindictive murderer with an apparent grudge against Sam and a cult-like appreciation of those who've worn the mask before them. One thing that's always set the Scream franchise apart from its slasher peers is that while Freddy, Michael, Jason and the like were all one entity that spanned their slayings across multiple movie massacres, Ghostface isn't a character but rather a moniker. The central premise of the Scream formula that's always gave these movies a fun edge, besides its wink at the camera meta-commentary on the slasher tropes and conventions, is that it could be anyone behind the mask, and that whodunit mystery drives the narrative forward as much as the lead's efforts to survive does, adding an extra compelling hook to the on-screen violence. Scream 6 is one of the best examples of this mystery in action, adding in and bringing back so many characters that the potential suspect list is at an all-time high, constantly making the audience second-guess their assumptions through multiple twists and subversions that come at such a rapid pace that nothing ever feels completely certain, right up until that inevitable and much-anticipated final act mask removal. Normally with these things as well, you can often suffer from what you might call the Scooby-Doo effect. Introducing so many characters to add to the ever-increasing suspect list seems great on paper, as it creates more mystery, more possible killers, more potential for surprises, but all of that is meaningless if when the final reveal comes and the mask flies off, it's just Old Man Jenkins! You know, that one dude, he had that one line right at the start, you remember him? And the audience responds like, yeah, kinda. And this is an easier trap to fall into than you'd think. I remember when I first saw Scream 3, the moment the killer was revealed, being like, oh, it's that guy, and feeling completely underwhelmed. Even when they afterward tried to make the whole thing feel more impactful by giving him a twisty monologue filled with secret reveals that tried to give this milquetoast decision some more gravity. Thankfully though, Scream 6 totally avoids these pitfalls, deftly weaving engaging character arcs and relationships for all its cast between the killings in a way that not only makes us more invested in their survival, but also gives their potential betrayal far more weight should they end up being the ones holding the knife at the end. Everyone feels suitably fleshed out and interesting and a huge key part of the story. No one feels inconsequential or tacked on in an effort to just pad out the body count or suspect list. And it manages to do all this while still delivering on the black comedy, the fun meta commentary, and the trademark horror and violence the series is known for, without overstuffing what feels like a genuinely breezy 2-hour runtime. Everything feels so tight, in fact, that while at first I was a little trepidatious about the lack of Neve Campbell returning as Sydney in this one after her contract negotiations fell through, having now seen the film, I honestly don't know where she'd fit in without her screen time having to actively eat into or even replace someone whose presence in this movie feels necessary and important. I still would have loved to see her get the right paycheck offer, and I'd love to peek into the alternate universe where she's in the movie just to see how it turned out. If I had to guess without spoiling anything, I think her role would have most likely taken a lot of the stuff that another legacy character does. But either way, I'm at least happy to say that her lack of appearance here doesn't hurt the story they're trying to tell, and arguably even enhances it in firmly placing the newer Carpenter sisters as the current final girl faces of the franchise. Plus, I've also seen that apparently she really likes this movie despite her absence from it, so that's good to hear. She still shouldn't have been undervalued though, stand by her on that one. Other highlights from the film include the vividly portrayed New York setting, which not only stands to give this entry its own unique identity, but is also utilised to the fullest in creating really great action set pieces that make use of the new location. Two of the biggest highlights of the movie, and the ones that were teased intensely in the trailers, is Ghostface's tense shotgun attack in the local bodega and the incredible subway scene, both of which I can confirm absolutely deliver, and mark some of the most tense highs the entire franchise has to offer. I recall a lot of folks being annoyed after we first saw a glimpse of the bodega scene that Ghostface had a gun, the concern being that they were taking the slash part out of the slasher concept, I think, and worried that this made the whole thing visually less scary and less in the spirit of the genre. But at the end of the day, it's just one scene, and Ghostface carrying a gun is, at least in my opinion, exactly the kind of thing this series should be doing. Scream as a franchise is always one that has had its fingers placed firmly on the pulse of not just what makes slashers tick, but the ways of the world that it resides in. It's always commented metatextually on not just film conventions, but equally on America's relationship with the media and violence. From Skeet Ulrich's iconic line delivery of "movies don't create psychos, movies make psychos more creative," to Scream 3's commentary on the abuses of actresses within the film industry, to Scream 4's discussion of the content culture of social media and internet fame. Introducing Scream to the concept of gun violence doesn't just feel natural, if anything it feels overdue. I'm surprised we didn't get the image of a Ghostface gun massacre in Scream 5, and as far as concerns go with it feeling less scary or fun, the filmmakers do well to treat the gun violence with a level of graphic realism that makes it just as scary and tense as anything else in the franchise, but manage to find that fine line where they don't go so far as to get a bit too real and take out the entertaining fun of the scene. The inclusion of the gun here is just as important, in my opinion, as the inclusion of Sam being on the receiving end of a Reddit internet conspiracy, complete with ridiculous fan art simping for her to murder people, or the character Mindy's meta monologue about how they aren't just in reboot territory but franchise territory, explaining how this puts them all at risk from legacy characters to new additions, or the subway on Halloween being full of people in Ghostface costumes in between all the other pop culture characters. Someone who, in this fictional universe, is both a movie franchise star and a real flesh and blood serial killer with copycat murderers and a high body count. This is just another symptom of the continuing ways in which Scream, as a franchise, conceptually analyses our relationship with violence and media, and for me, it's an incredibly welcome addition. While we're on the subject of Ghostface and violence as well, this iteration's Ghostface is arguably the most intimidating and brutal the series has ever had in a way that feels like it really raises the stakes and level of danger. While the Scream saga has definitely had its fair share of scares, tension, and creative kills that have always left the iconic masked murderer feeling like a more than capable antagonist, the more grounded routes the series goes for in making their killers just some random person in a mask have at times gone arguably a bit too far in that direction. Scream 3's Ghostface in particular often stumbles and fumbles so much through his attempted killings that it borders on physical comedy. Ghostface here, though, is genuinely menacing. There's a personality that comes out from behind the mask that suggests that whoever is doing these killings is actively relishing in the misery they're inflicting throughout. There's a scene early on with a ladder escape where the killer really takes their time in wandering over to their would-be victim, slams their knife down in the windowsill with theatricality before grabbing the feet of the ladder in a purposefully frantic manner and really toying with them. When they finish with a kill, they make sure to let their next target see them swiftly clean their blade while they stare into their eyes as if to say, "You're next, I'm getting this ready for you." It's all really effectively chilling. The kills are way more brutal and personal this time too. This Ghostface doesn't just stab, they gut, twisting and tearing with their knife while they bask in their victim's pain, engaging in a level of graphic violence the series has never really had before. It all serves to put some of the scary back into the slasher that they've honestly quite long been missing. When the trailers emphasise that line exchange between the killer and Gale where Ghostface says, "There's never been one quite like me," I figured it was just generic sequel, bigger and better fluff dialogue to convince people there was a reason that this one was going to be scarier than the last. But it turns out it was kind of a true statement. I really don't think there has been a Ghostface like the one in this film. And it's not just Ghostface who performs well here, everyone knocks it out of the park. All of the actors give engaging, sympathetic performances, everyone has great chemistry together, the new characters fit seamlessly with the old without missing a beat, and the stories and relationships that tie them all together are often genuinely quite human and touching. These people aren't just the cannon fodder archetypes of slashers of old, but really fleshed out beings with motivations and fears and goals and baggage. It's great. No one feels static, everyone feels like they're evolving. I love how smart everyone feels, like they're battle hardened from all the previous times they've had to go through this kind of thing. I know it's a bit cliche to point out how dumb characters in horror movies can be, and while I don't think this criticism is often used all that fairly, as you really can't expect characters in a narrative to be aware of the genre they are in, I still gotta say it does feel genuinely refreshing when characters actively make great decisions and still fall victim to trouble anyway. When Ghostface first appears in New York and makes their first attack on the Carpenter sisters, immediately the two of them are like, "Okay, cool, let's skip town." Like, none of this, "No, I won't keep running, this is my life, this is where I live." They're both just like, "Nah, let's just get the hell out of Dodge," and resent the fact that the police are keeping them here. The ways in which they attempt to catch or defeat Ghostface are clever and actively acknowledge learning from past occurrences, and on the flip side, the way Ghostface expects them to have learned from these occurrences and so flips the script and changes from the usual approach to undermine these smart decisions is just as clever and makes for a super engaging game of cat and mouse that not only acknowledges its own legacy, but often subverts it in fresh and interesting new ways. Extremely minor spoilers here, but there's a borderline genius moment where Gale Weathers hangs up on Ghostface and hits redial in order to hear where the phone is calling from, and like, wow, that's so simple and so smart. And yet, I wouldn't even thought to do that as an audience member with all the power to easily armchair critique these characters' decisions from the stake-free safety of my comfy cinema seat. It's just an absolute banger from start to finish. a smart, funny, subversive slasher that seamlessly interweaves fan service and its own legacy into a refreshing new and engaging direction and setting. This movie is an absolutely standout slasher sequel in a series of standout slasher sequels. Like I said, I expected to enjoy it, but I thought I'd have a great time with it the way I had a great time with 5. I'd go to the cinema, have a blast, leave happy, but besides a couple of standout moments, not really feel much of a need to discuss or revisit the film afterwards. But my partner and I literally haven't shut up about Scream 6 since we saw it this past weekend. Every time we think about it, there's another little clever thing we can assess or appreciate. And listen, after Wholesome Halloween 2, it's probably no secret that I could be considered a bit of a slasher guy, and on that note, let me recommend this as some of the most fun you can have in that genre. But I don't just want to recommend it as a slasher fan. I don't just want to recommend it as a horror fan. I don't even want to recommend it specifically as a Scream fan, although it will absolutely satisfy the appetites of all those coming from those perspectives. I want to recommend it though as just a damn good film. It's funny, it's tense, it's emotional, it's filled with great throwbacks, it's full of great subversions, it's got great characters, great chemistry, great set pieces, great action, great kills, a great antagonist, a great mystery. It's just great. And I'm gonna say it. And I don't care if people get mad at me, as they often do when you make statements like this on the internet. I honestly think it's probably my second favourite Scream movie, trumped only by the original. Yes, I like it better than Scream 2. Don't at me.